Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. A few weeks ago, I stumbled back across one of my favorite internet memes. It revolves around Cookout, the beloved southern regional fast food chain that has developed, something of a cult following across the Southeast, especially in college towns. Okay, so if you've never experienced Cookout before, imagine a place where the drive-thru line somehow stretches endlessly at midnight, the milkshake menu feels approximately the length of a novella, and the tray combinations appear to have been assembled by people asking not whether should things go together, but what could. The meme itself asks a beautifully ridiculous question. What if a main entree was a side dish? Because at Cookout, your sides are not necessarily fries or coleslaw. Your sides can be a quesadilla, or a chicken wrap, or a corn dog, or nuggets. The categories collapse entirely. Somewhere along the way, Cookout looked at the traditional fast food hierarchy and decided, it was optional. And I fully recognize that building an educational philosophy around a late-night southern fast food chain may not have been on anyone's bingo card for this podcast, including mine. But the longer I sit with that meme, the more I realized I was tapping into something surprisingly real about how young people experience possibility. In many ways, schools have been historically designed around order, clarity, and even containment. Students move through prescribed pathways. They are separated into categories. Certain disciplines are elevated, while others are quietly treated as secondary. Academic achievement sits at the center, while other experiences are often framed as enrichment or enhancement, rather than the essential parts of student development. Now, education for a very long time has been deeply invested in deciding what counts as the entree and what counts as the side dish. The core curriculum mattered. The extracurriculars complemented it. The serious students specialized, the arts enriched, clubs supplemented, relationships supported, and exploration happened around the margins. And to be fair, some of the structure emerged for understandable reasons. Schools were designed in an era where access itself was often limited. Advanced coursework was scarce, opportunities for acceleration restricted, higher education, at least at the time, was less accessible. The system rewarded standardization because standardization made scale possible, at least in the early 20th century. But increasingly, I think many schools are discovering that students themselves no longer experience identity in learning in such neat categories. Today's students are simultaneously researchers and artists, engineers and musicians, athletes and entrepreneurs, coders and storytellers. They don't naturally divide themselves into singular academic lanes as easily as previous generations may have. And perhaps more importantly, some of those experiences that shape students most profoundly are often the very things schools historically treated as side dishes. Mentorship, travel, clubs, research, community engagement, creative work, interdisciplinary collaboration, relationships with faculty, conversations in residence halls, shared late-night struggles over impossible assignments, the feeling of belonging to something intellectually alive. Schools spent decades treating some of the most transformative parts of adolescence as enrichment rather than infrastructure. And one of the things I've often thought about through my own career is that environments themselves communicate possibility long before mission statements ever do. Before students can necessarily articulate what a school offers, they often feel whether the place expects them to become larger versions of themselves. You see, some schools feel constrained, procedural, transactional, carefully optimized. Others, though, feel expansive, layered, full of motion and curiosity and unexpected combinations. The energy of those places communicates something powerful to students. There may be more versions of yourself available here than you previously imagined. And honestly, I think that matters enormously for talent development, particularly for students from rural, first-generation backgrounds or communities where certain opportunities have historically felt distant. The challenge is not always raw ability. Sometimes the challenge is permission. The kind of permission to imagine themselves differently, the permission to combine interests that previously seemed incompatible, and the permission to see themselves in spaces they had not considered reachable. I think one of the reasons that specialized schools, residential schools, and early college environments can feel so transformative is not simply because they offer advanced coursework. It's because they create ecosystems where unexpected combinations become normalized. A student who loved math suddenly discovers debate. A future physician develops a passion for philosophy. A student interested in engineering falls deeply into theater production. In these spaces, young people begin constructing identities through collision rather than confinement. And perhaps that is part of what the cookout meme accidentally captures. The tray itself is memorable not because it is efficient, but because it feels expansive. The combinations are surprising, slightly absurd, weirdly joyful. The system invites experimentation. Nobody at cookout looks at you and says, "I'm sorry, but your quesadilla and chicken wrap combination violates the traditional hierarchy of side dishes." The menu instead grants permission. Now, a few weeks ago on the podcast, I talked a bit about the broader cultural conversation around abundance and the idea that institutions can either organize themselves primarily around scarcity or around possibility. And I found myself thinking back to that conversation while staring at a cookout menu. Not because schools should become chaotic for the sake of chaos. There's already enough chaos in the day-to-day life of schools. And certainly not because students need infinite options or endless activity accumulation. In fact, I think one of the dangers in modern education is that we sometimes confuse abundance with overload. Students can absolutely drown in opportunity. They can become trapped in performative busyness, resume stacking, and the exhaustion that emerges when every experience becomes another form of optimization. Nobody actually needs 2 quesadillas, Cajun fries, a corn dog, and a milkshake at 1 o'clock in the morning. But meaningful abundance is different from performative maximalism. Students do not necessarily need more things. They need environments rich enough to help them discover who they are becoming. And I think that distinction matters tremendously. The schools that students remember most are rarely the ones that simply managed them efficiently. They are the places that made life feel larger, the places where curiosity expanded, the classrooms where students encountered people unlike themselves, the places where unexpected interest emerged and where possibility felt tangible and proximate rather than abstract and distant. Increasingly, I suspect the future of education may belong less to institutions that perfectly optimize specialization and more to institutions that create meaningful collisions between disciplines, people, and opportunities. That doesn't mean that structure disappears. It doesn't mean that rigor disappears. It doesn't mean that schools abandon coherence or intentionality. I think it simply means we may need to think differently about what counts as central to human development and learning. Because the truth is, some of the experiences that most profoundly shape students are the very things that traditional models have often treated as peripheral: belonging, conversation, exploration, creativity, community, risk-taking, interdisciplinary curiosity. These are not the educational side dishes. They may actually be a part of the entree. And perhaps that is the surprisingly profound question sitting underneath this ridiculous internet meme about a southern fast food chain. What if some of the things we have historically categorized as secondary are actually central to helping young people flourish? What if schools are not simply places students go to accumulate credentials, but ecosystems where students begin constructing more expansive understandings of themselves and their futures? And what if the environments that ultimately matter the most are the ones generous enough, intellectually, emotionally, culturally, to allow those unexpected combinations to emerge? I think somewhere along the way, Cookout accidentally stumbled into a fascinating question for educators. What happens when we stop obsessing over rigid categories and start building environments where possibility feels abundant enough for students to surprise even themselves? That may sound like an absurd lesson to draw from a drive-through tray menu. But honestly, the older I get, the more I think there's something deeply true hidden inside the chaos. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.